your host, Bill Calkins, and in an effort to provide this critical information in any way you choose to consume educational content, we are pleased to offer it in video and podcast formats. My guest, Dr. Josh Henry, a technical specialist with Ball Seed, is back to finish, literally, his discussion of Vegetative Angelonia as part of our Tech on Demand series covering key annuals and perennials commercially produced around the world. He recently joined me to discuss Vegetative Angelonia propagation, and now he returns to help you finish the crop. There's been a ton of breeding on Vegetative Angelonia in the past decade, and the results have driven consumer and landscape demand, as well as moving Angelonia north on the map. It's been known as a fantastic heat and drought lover in southern climates, but new colors and habits have increased its appeal across all of North America and around the world. Tall, short, big blooms, or tons of smaller ones, a range of colors, and even spreading habits are available in Vegetative Angelonia. Seriously, what's not to love about this crop? Speaking of what we like, if you like this installment, be sure to subscribe to the Tech on Demand podcast on your favorite podcast app and find dozens of Tech on Demand videos on the Ball Seed YouTube channel. Josh, once again, welcome to Tech on Demand. I will include a link to our Vegetative Angelonia propagation content in the show notes. So why don't you jump right in to finishing the crop?
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Bill. Angelonia is a fairly easy crop to grow. There's not typically a lot of pest or disease concerns. However, there are some other specific concerns that I'd like to talk about today. So let's jump into it. To start off, let's talk a little bit about the background of Angelonia, something to keep in mind as we are producing these plants. Generally, most of the varieties that are out there are propagated vegetatively. However, there are a couple of different series out there that are seed-based. This presentation will focus primarily on the vegetative Angelonia. However, a lot of the production strategies will work for either seed or vegetative Angelonia. One of the main things that I want you all to keep in mind is that these plants originated in Mexico or Central America, which means that they are very heat and drought tolerant. However, this also means that you need to give them really sufficient levels of heat as you are producing these plants. They cannot be grown cold, or you'll run into a lot of potential production issues that we'll talk about in the next couple of minutes. Generally, when you're growing Angelonia, depending on the container size, the environmental conditions, and the variety, it's going to take somewhere in the range of about 5 to 12 weeks to grow out these plants. Of course, if you're growing them in the north, you're growing them a little bit earlier in the season, it's going to take a little bit on the longer end of that production range. If you're using very large container sizes, they can take a while to fill up. If you're using a smaller container, you're going to be on the shorter end of that cycle. But we'll talk about that a little bit more coming up. When you have your liners that are ready for transplant, whether you did those in-house or purchased them in, you should plant those liners immediately upon arrival. As soon as they're ready, you should try and get them transplanted. Holding those liners will only help to promote root-bound liners, which will result in a reduced quality of liner and will ultimately yield a lower quality plant. If you do need to hold those liners, you can hold them briefly if needed, but it's important to make sure that you're still giving them the correct environmental conditions. Generally, you should hold these at about 70-degree days or a little bit less, and somewhere in the range of about 60 to 65 degree Fahrenheit nights. You never want to go lower than 60 degrees Fahrenheit with Angelonia because these plants are very cold sensitive. When you get down into the 55 or even 50-degree Fahrenheit range, this will basically inhibit their root function and prevent them from taking up nutrients, even if you are continuing to fertilize them. So it's important to make sure that you keep those temperatures sufficiently high. And that is another important thing to remember is even if you are holding them at the right temperature, you still also need to continue feeding them. You know, as a grower, you may worry that if you continue to feed them, they're going to get tall and stretched. But that's why you really want to lean on those high nitrate-based fertilizers, something like a 15-5-15, 17-5-17, that's going to help keep those plants toned and compact, but give them the nutrients they need to grow. At this point, it's also a good point to mention the different branching options that we have available. As I mentioned in my previous presentation on propagation, many of the times propagators will choose to pinch the Angelonia in the liner tray. And whether or not that's done, you may also want to consider pinching after transplant. A lot of times these different varieties are recommended to be pinched once during production if it's in a smaller size container, and maybe twice if it's in a larger size container. But generally speaking, if you choose to pinch it after transplant, you'll want to pinch about 1 to 2 weeks after transplant. That gives that liner enough time to start rooting out into its new container and start establishing itself prior to that pinch. You also want to make sure that regardless of what you do in terms of pinching or PGRs, you want to ensure that you have sufficient levels of light and fertilizer, because these are essential to promote branching in your plants. If you don't provide enough light, that is one of the surefire ways that you'll have to have a long, leggy plant with very poor branching. So make sure you have good light levels, make sure you're providing sufficient fertilizer, and that's going to do a lot to help promote branching. You can potentially use some PGRs also to help with branching. Florel or Ethifon is not recommended, while it does work in a wide variety of different plants. Angelonia tend to be fairly ethylene sensitive, and they can run into issues of leaf tip burn and other potential problems of distortion and delayed flowering. Specifically, if you apply Ethifon or Florel to Angelonia, you need to wait at least 8 weeks after that application to ensure that they're going to actually get to flowering. So in general, no one's really going to recommend Florel on Angelonia. However, there has been some research done recently, which I'll get into in a little bit here, on Configure, which has been a really great PGR that we have to help promote branching. And generally, the recommendation looks to be about 400 parts per million of Configure can be effective to promote that branching. But we'll get into that in a few minutes here. As far as containers and substrates are concerned, you're going to want to use a very standard, well-drained substrate, nothing too crazy here, pH of about 5.8 to 6.2. Use a fairly moderate to high starter charge of a EC of about 1 to 1.5, just to make sure that they have the nutrients they need after transplant to help push new growth. And as far as container sizes and the number of plants and production time, if you're doing something in about a 4 to 5 inch container, you'll want to use 1 plant per pot for pretty much all varieties. And the crop time should be somewhere in the range of 5 to 8 weeks. For a 6-inch pot, you're going to want to use about 1 to 3 plants per pot with a crop time of about 7 to 10 weeks. And if you're using a large container, a 10 to 12 inch, a combo or a hanging basket, something like that, you'll want to use typically about 3 to 5 plants per pot and have a crop time of about 10 to 12 weeks. But again, this is going to vary depending on your environmental conditions and also the variety being grown. So it's always recommended to look at the specific crop culture sheet for the variety that you're growing, just to make sure that you're falling within these ranges. For fertility and moisture management, fertilizers, you want to use a high nitrogen fertilizer, like I mentioned before, something like a 15-5-15 or 17-5-17 at about 175 to 225 parts per million nitrogen. You want to make sure that you're using a fertilizer that's not too high in ammonium or phosphorus, because that combination of ammonium and phosphorus really helps to cause excessive stretch and very soft growth, which is not something that we want from our Angelonia. So to maintain a nice compact plant that's not too stretched and has good branching, stick with those higher nitrate formula fertilizers. For your EC, you want to have a pour-through EC of about 2.3 to 3.2 millisiemens per centimeter. And if you're doing it based on SME, it would be about 1.5 to 2.1 millisiemens per centimeter. For your moisture management, it's pretty straightforward. You just want to irrigate up to about a level 4 and back down to a level 2, right? You don't ever want to go to those extremes of letting it dry out completely or letting it sit in saturated media. One thing to call out, I mentioned earlier that these plants are fairly drought tolerant, and that is true. However, if you continue to water stress them and take them down to a level 1 for extended periods or consistently, that can cause tip burn. The plants will recover and continue to grow just fine, but if you damage those leaves, that's obviously going to affect the final plant. So make sure that you're giving them the irrigation that they require. As far as light and temperature are concerned, these are probably 2 of the most important factors that you need to remember when you're growing Angelonia. For light, you want to maintain a very high light intensity during finishing of about 800 to 1200 micromoles per square meter per second. And looking at that in terms of the daily light integral, or DLI, you want to accumulate about 16 to 18 moles per day. You can still grow a decent Angelonia with as little as 8 to 10, but again, the higher light levels are definitely recommended for this species. And one of the most important reasons why we want to have that really high light, again, is to promote branching. Most of the different resources that you can find, all the different culture sheets, will talk about how when you have those low light levels, that really is what leads to very stretched plants with very poor branching, poor growth habit, and eventually also poor flowering. So maintaining those really high levels of light is essential, especially if you are a grower in the north and it's early season and you don't have enough light. You may need to consider supplemental lighting to get you the light levels that you need. And here, I also have a little bit of research I wanted to call out from Roberto Lopez, looking at the effects of increasing light quality or quantity on greenhouse crops. And basically what he did is he took some different Angelonia grown under different propagation DLIs and different finishing DLIs. And when you look at the research, you can see that the higher light levels, both in propagation and in finishing, yield a much larger and more robust plant. So again, super important. There's been a lot of great research, but super important to have those sufficient light levels. As far as temperatures are concerned, you want to maintain fairly high temperatures. Day temperature recommendation should be in the range of about 75 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and night temperatures should be in the range of about 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, like I mentioned back when we talked about holding liners, we never want to go below 60. That's definitely basically the stopping point. You want to try and keep it above 60 at all times. For plant growth regulators to control growth, the two main recommendations are to use something like B9 at 1,500 to 3,000 parts per million, and you can also use that in a tank mix with Altercell at 750 to 1,000 parts per million. Those are the two main go-tos. However, depending on the literature that you look at and the sources, you can use a wider variety of other PGRs as well. You can use something like Arest applied at about 4 to 10 parts per million, and you can also use something like Top Floor at 45 to 60 parts per million. Bonsai is something that you can potentially use as a spray. Some reported rates are about 5 to 80 parts per million, which of course is quite variable. And you can also choose to use bonsai as a drench toward the end of production if you're trying to hold them. Once they've gotten to the point of the mature size that you want, or approximately 95% of that mature size, you can apply a bonsai drench of about 1 to 4 parts per million just to hold it at finishing. As I mentioned earlier too, you can use Configure at about 400 parts per million as a spray to induce lateral branching. There's a photo here from some of Roberto Lopez's research, his article Branching Out with PGRs and Grower Talks. He did 200, 400, and 800 parts per million Configure, and the best results were obtained with about 400 parts per million. One important thing to call out with Configure, as it's been something that we as an industry have been trialing on lots of different varieties. Configure can work really, really well on one variety, and it can work really, really poorly on another, to the extent where it may simply have no effect, or it can cause a lot of phytotoxicity. So especially if you're considering using something like Configure, I'd highly recommend that you trial using it prior to applying it to your entire crop, just to make sure that the specific varieties that you're growing are not too sensitive to it and will also yield a really positive outcome of induced lateral branching. In terms of pests and diseases, Angelonia aren't affected by very commonly. As far as pests are concerned, some of the main ones are aphids, whiteflies, thrips, and spider mites. However, they're not typically that big of an issue if you just maintain good cultural practices and just keep a good eye on things, good scouting practices to make sure that there's nothing popping up. And then as far as diseases and disorders are concerned, the main ones that are really a concern would be botrytis blight, which can be an issue at any time of production, but especially when you've got high humidity, water on the leaves, plants being packed too close together. You can run into issues with root rots. Pythium and Rhizoctonia can be an issue, but aren't typically a huge problem for Angelonia. There's a few viruses, INSV. Here's a photo that I have from an article from Brian Whipker and Patrick Veazey, looking at different viral pathogens that they saw out in the field in 2023. And you can see INSV can cause symptoms of mottling, distortion, stunting, and necrosis on plants in general, but also specifically on Angelonia. And then specifically, Angelonia can run into a couple of common nutrient deficiencies. One of them being iron deficiency, of course, when the pH gets too high or you keep the plants too wet and it really limits root function, you can run into iron deficiency on those upper leaves, interveinal chlorosis on the upper leaves. All you really need to do for something like that is just to bring your pH down where it needs to be, and you can use supplemental iron applications. Something specifically that has iron and manganese would be really, really great, and especially if those are chelated sources. Those are going to help to correct the symptoms that you see on those upper leaves. And then boron deficiency is also an issue, and that's one that I want to call out specifically. This is an issue that we see commonly in the landscape, but it can also happen in production. And basically, if you see a boron deficiency, like you see here, basically the difference between a boron deficient plant and a healthy plant is that the boron deficient plant will basically have flower bud atrophy, where those flower buds start to form, but then just kind of shrivel up and die away. You may also see symptoms like upper leaf curling, distortion, and things like that. You may also see stem tip abortion, where the growing point dies on the plant. And generally speaking, this can be due to a number of factors. In production, the main factor that would cause this boron deficiency is if you're providing insufficient levels of boron fertilizer. And basically, the time that this might happen is, say you need to hold your plants at the end of production, and so you decide to cut back your fertilizer rate or withhold fertilization. You can quickly run into an issue where if you're not providing that boron through the fertilizer, you're going to see these types of boron deficiency symptoms. In the landscape, it's often seen because you just maybe don't have sufficient fertilizer or you don't provide enough water, right? And while these plants are very drought tolerant, if they don't have water, they're not able to take up nutrients, specifically boron, and you run into problems with boron deficiency. So watch out for things like excessive water restriction, insufficient fertilizers, and cutting your fertilizer rate or holding plants. Those are the main things that you want to watch out for to prevent these types of issues with boron deficiency. And with that, you should have a better understanding of Angelonia production. Some of the key points that I wanted to highlight as we end our little talk here is to keep these plants nice and warm with lots of light to promote branching, provide sufficient fertility levels, both in terms of application frequency as well as the rate. And this is especially true for things like boron. And also utilize your high nitrate fertilizers to help keep plants compact and give you a really nice growth habit. You can also utilize a lot of PGRs like B9 and Ultracell to help keep those plants compact. And with that, thanks for listening. I'll hand it back to Bill.
That's awesome, Josh. Thank you so much. And for that recap, especially, I think that you said early on it was not a too difficult of a crop to grow, that being Vegetative Angelonia, but there are definitely some nuances, and like everything, just pay attention to the details, and should be good to go with the crop. And on this slide, you can see that we have dozens, probably hundreds of Tech on Demand educational resources online. Every week, I send a newsletter covering a range of cultural and technical topics. We created more than 200 videos for growers of all skill levels. Some of them make excellent training videos for you and your team. The Tech on Demand podcast is a great way to learn about technical topics on the go and to connect with a massive global network of more than 6,000 of your professional greenhouse peers. I suggest you join the Greenhouse Tech Team group on Facebook. All you need to do is search Greenhouse Tech Team, answer a couple simple questions, and I will let you in. Josh, again, thank you so much for your time. I think we still have some more crops to cover, so we're going to be back at it before too long, right?
Absolutely. Thanks, Bill.
I'm Bill Calkins with Tech on Demand, and on behalf of our entire team, thank you for listening and watching, and take care out there.